The air in the courtroom was a suffocating blend of expensive perfume and stale anxiety. All eyes were on the couple at the center of the storm, Arthur and Eleanor Vance, the city's golden couple now fractured beyond recognition. The press called it the divorce of the decade, but they had no idea. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors burst open. A woman, her face a mask of desperate fury, stormed down the aisle. She was young, beautiful, and very, very pregnant. "He can't divorce you to leave me with nothing," she screamed, one hand protectively on her swollen belly, the other pointing a trembling finger at Arthur. "This baby is a Vance. He is your son." A tidal wave of gasps and camera flashes filled the room. Arthur turned sheet white. But his wife Eleanor, the woman being publicly humiliated, did not flinch. She did not cry. She simply sat there, a statue of impossible calm, her hands folded in her lap, watching the chaos unfold, as if she were merely a spectator. Her silence was the most terrifying sound in the room. The Honorable Judge Albright, a woman whose stern expression had been carved by decades of witnessing human folly, banged her gavel with a crack that momentarily silenced the frenzied whispers. "Order," she commanded, her voice cutting through the pandemonium. "Bailiff, escort the interruption to the witness stand. We will address this outburst with the decorum this court demands." The pregnant woman, who the tabloids had already identified as Madeline Shaw, a junior art curator, was led still sobbing to the stand. Her dress of vibrant crimson was a stark slash of color against the somber mahogany of the courtroom. It was a declaration of war. Arthur Vance, a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms and charming investors, looked utterly broken. He couldn't meet his wife's eyes. He couldn't look at Madeline. He stared at the polished surface of his defendant's table, as if it held the answers to a life that had just spectacularly imploded. His lawyer, a silver-haired shark named Mr. Harrington, was already on his feet, whispering furiously into Arthur's ear, but his client seemed deaf to the advice. "State your name for the record," Judge Albright said, her gaze fixed on Madeline. "Madeline Shaw," she answered, her voice trembling but defiant. "And I am here because Arthur Vance is trying to erase me, to erase his son." She placed a hand on her belly again, a gesture both maternal and theatrical. "He promised me everything. He told me his marriage was a loveless sham, a business arrangement. He said he loved me. He begged me to have his child, the heir he said his wife could never give him." A new wave of murmurs rippled through the gallery. The accusation of infertility, lobbed like a grenade at the stoic Eleanor, was brutally personal. Every eye in the room swiveled to her, waiting for the crack in her perfect composure. They wanted to see the tears, the fury, the shame. They saw nothing. Eleanor Vance sat with an unnerving stillness, her posture impeccable. She was an architect, a woman who built things, who understood that a strong foundation was everything. Her face, framed by dark, elegant hair, was a study in neutrality. Her lawyer, Beatrice Croft, a woman with a mind as sharp as her tailored suit, placed a reassuring hand on her arm, but Eleanor gave no indication she had even felt it. She simply watched Madeline, her gaze not cold, but analytical, as if she were examining a structural flaw in a blueprint. "Mr. Harrington," the judge said, turning her attention to Arthur's counsel, "your client is being accused of fathering this woman's unborn child. This has a direct bearing on the division of assets and potential future support. Do you have a response?" Harrington cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. "Your Honor, my client vehemently denies making any such promises. Miss Shaw was a regrettable indiscretion, a youthful mistake. We believe she is an opportunistic individual attempting to extort the Vance family. We have no proof that the child is in fact Mr. Vance's." "I knew you'd say that," Madeline shrieked, lurching forward before the bailiff gently restrained her. "I have texts, I have emails, I have everything, and I demand a paternity test right here, right now. Let's see who's lying then." The room held its breath. This was it. The moment of truth. A court-ordered DNA test would settle everything. It would prove Arthur a liar and a cheat, cementing Madeline's claim on the vast Vance fortune. For Eleanor, it would be the final crushing humiliation. Mr. Harrington looked ready to object to delay to file a dozen motions to bury this demand in paperwork. But before he could speak, a new voice, calm and clear, filled the silence. It was Beatrice Croft, Eleanor's lawyer. She had risen to her feet, her expression unreadable. "Your Honor." Beatrice said, her voice steady and measured. "We will not be objecting to Miss Shaw's request." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Harrington's jaw literally dropped. Arthur looked up, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. Why would they agree? Why would Eleanor willingly walk into this final public degradation? Beatrice Croft continued, her words precise and deliberate. "In fact, we welcome it. My client, Mrs. Vance, has always believed in the truth, no matter how painful. We agree to a court-mandated, legally binding DNA test to establish the paternity of Miss Shaw's child." Madeline Shaw smiled a triumphant, tear-streaked smirk. She had won. She had blown up their perfect lives and was about to be rewarded for it. But Beatrice wasn't finished. She held up a single finger, pausing for dramatic effect, that held every person in the room captive. "However," she added, her voice dropping slightly, drawing everyone in, "we have one condition." Judge Albright raised an eyebrow. "Go on, Ms. Croft." "To ensure a complete and irrefutable result, free from any possible ambiguity or future legal challenge regarding the Vance family lineage," Beatrice stated, "we stipulate that the sample from the unborn child be tested not only against Mr. Arthur Vance, but also against his father, Mr. Robert Vance." The silence that followed was no longer quiet. It was a crushing physical presence. The demand was bizarre, unorthodox. Why on earth would they need to test the grandfather? It seemed redundant, almost nonsensical. Mr. Harrington shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. That is preposterous. It's irrelevant and deeply insulting to the Vance family patriarch. What possible legal grounds could they have for such an invasive and offensive request?" Judge Albright looked at Beatrice, her expression demanding a justification. Beatrice met her gaze without blinking. "The Vance family legacy, Your Honor, is built on the concept of an unbroken bloodline. It is the very foundation of their financial empire, their trusts, their inheritance structures. Miss Shaw is claiming her child is the next link in that chain. To confirm that claim beyond any shadow of a doubt, we must establish a clear two-generation paternal link. It is a matter of thoroughness to protect the integrity of the proceedings and prevent any future claims that the sample was mishandled or that a coincidental genetic marker created a false positive. We simply want to be absolutely, unequivocally certain. My client insists on it." Arthur looked from his lawyer to Eleanor, his face a swirling mess of confusion and rising panic. He didn't understand the strategy. It was humiliating not just to him, but to his father, a proud, almost tyrannical man who valued his reputation above all else. Eleanor finally moved. She turned her head slightly and her eyes met Arthur's for the first time that day. There was no pain in her expression. No anger. There was something else. Something that looked terrifyingly like pity. Judge Albright considered the motion for a long moment, her fingers steepled before her lips. The legal argument was thin but plausible. It was unusual, but in a high-stakes divorce involving a massive fortune, thoroughness was a powerful argument. "The request is unconventional, Ms. Croft," the judge said slowly. "But given the financial stakes and the public nature of this dispute, I am inclined to prevent any and all future litigation on this matter. The court's interest is in a definitive final resolution." She looked over at a stunned Mr. Harrington. "I'm allowing it. Motion granted. The court will order a comparative DNA analysis with samples from Mr. Arthur Vance and Mr. Robert Vance. The results will be delivered under seal directly to this court." She banged her gavel again. The sound echoed the final nail being hammered into the coffin of the Vance family's pristine public image. Madeline Shaw looked momentarily confused by the strange condition, but her triumphant smile quickly returned. She had gotten what she wanted. Only Eleanor and her lawyer knew that what they had just set in motion was not about proving the paternity of a mistress's baby. It was about exposing a lie so foundational, so deeply buried, that its revelation wouldn't just end a marriage. It would obliterate an entire dynasty. The Vance penthouse on Park Avenue was less a home and more a museum of a perfect life. It was a space of cool, marble-polished glass and art chosen for its investment potential rather than its beauty. For 12 years, Eleanor had been its curator. She had designed the custom cabinetry, selected the neutral color palettes, and ensured that every surface reflected the cold, flawless image of the Vance name. It was a beautiful cage, and she had been its willing, silent prisoner. Their marriage had begun like a fairy tale, at least to outsiders. Arthur Vance, the charismatic heir to a real estate empire, and Eleanor Hayes, a brilliant, quietly ambitious architect from a respectable but not wealthy family. He was the charming public face. She was the elegant, intelligent force behind the scenes. She managed their homes, designed the renovations on their commercial properties, and hosted flawless dinner parties where billion-dollar deals were born over dessert. She was the perfect partner, the perfect accessory. But a good architect knows that even the most beautiful facade can hide rot in the foundation. The cracks had started small. A lingering scent of unfamiliar perfume on his suit jacket. Late-night meetings that resulted in no new business. A second phone she found tucked away in his gym bag. Each discovery was a small tremor, a sign that the ground beneath her feet was unstable. At first she had confronted him. Their fights were quiet, civilized affairs conducted in hushed tones in their cavernous living room so the staff wouldn't hear. Arthur was a master of deflection. He would gaslight her, calling her paranoid, insecure, even crazy. He'd shower her with gifts, a diamond bracelet, a surprise trip to Milan, temporary patches over the ever-widening fissures. He made her feel as though her suspicions were the problem, not his actions. For a time, she believed him. She wanted to believe him. The turning point came not with a dramatic discovery, but with a quiet, mundane observation. It was at his father's 70th birthday party, a lavish affair at the family estate in Connecticut. The patriarch, Robert Vance, was holding court, a booming, self-important man who spoke of blood and legacy as if he were a medieval king. He was a man of pronounced features, a strong aquiline nose, deep-set hazel eyes, and a distinctive, prominent chin. His brother Arthur's uncle had the same features. So did his cousins. The Vance look was as recognizable as a corporate logo. As Eleanor watched Arthur stand beside his father, laughing at a joke, she saw it with the sudden jarring clarity of an architect spotting a misaligned support beam. Arthur shared none of it. He had his mother's fair hair and lighter build, but none of the powerful defining features of the Vance men. He had always been told he took after his mother's side of the family, and no one had ever questioned it. But standing there, surrounded by 3 generations of Vance men, Arthur looked like a stranger, an outlier, a well-crafted counterfeit. The thought was so jarring, so treasonous, that she pushed it away. It was absurd, but the seed of doubt had been planted. An architect's mind is trained to see patterns, to notice details others miss. She started looking. She pulled out old family photo albums. In every picture, from christenings to graduations, the difference was there, hiding in plain sight. It was then that her strategy shifted. She stopped confronting Arthur about his infidelities. That was just a symptom of a much larger disease of lies. She knew her marriage was over, but she refused to be cast as the hysterical, scorned wife. She would not be a victim in her own life story. She would be the architect of its conclusion. She hired Beatrice Croft, a lawyer known not for her courtroom theatrics, but for her meticulous, ruthless preparation. In their first meeting in Beatrice's discreet midtown office, Eleanor laid out her suspicions. "I don't just want a divorce, Beatrice," Eleanor had said, her voice calm and even. "I want the truth. All of it." She didn't speak of Arthur's affairs, not at first. Instead, she talked about financial discrepancies she had noticed. Assets moved into complex trusts that seemed designed to shield them from a potential divorce settlement. She spoke of her contributions to the Vance Corporation, the designs she had provided for which she was never formally compensated, the social and business connections she had cultivated that had directly led to profitable ventures. She had documented everything with the precision of a blueprint, complete with dates, figures, and names. Beatrice was impressed. "Most spouses in your position come in here with tears and vague accusations. You've come with a ledger. But what does this have to do with—" "The other thing, the foundation, Beatrice," Eleanor explained. "The entire Vance empire, the trusts, the inheritance, it's all predicated on one thing: Robert Vance's patriarchal lineage, his name, his blood. If that foundation proves to be fraudulent, the entire structure becomes unstable." Beatrice's eyes widened as she grasped the sheer audacity of Eleanor's plan. It was a high-stakes gamble. If she was wrong, she would be eviscerated in court and in the press for making such a malicious, unfounded accusation against a powerful family. "How can you be sure?" Beatrice asked, her voice a low whisper. "I can't be," Eleanor admitted. "Not 100%. But I know my husband. I know his father. Their greatest weakness is their pride, their arrogance. They believe they are untouchable. And Arthur's current affair, this girl Madeline, she's not like the others. She's reckless, desperate. She thinks she's a player in their game, but she's just a pawn. And I'm going to use her to checkmate the king." Over the next 6 months, Eleanor played the part of the long-suffering wife perfectly. She continued to host dinners, smile at charity events, and ignore the whispers. In private, she and Beatrice worked tirelessly, building their case brick by brick. They hired a discreet private investigator who confirmed Arthur's affair with Madeline Shaw, documenting their meetings, his lavish gifts, and his empty promises. When Madeline became pregnant, Eleanor knew her moment had arrived. She knew Arthur would be panicked, and his first instinct would be to cut Madeline off to try and make the problem disappear. And she knew a woman like Madeline wouldn't disappear quietly. She would detonate. The day Arthur finally confessed and asked for a divorce, telling Eleanor he wanted to end things amicably, Eleanor had agreed with a serenity that deeply unsettled him. She filed first. Her petition was simple, straightforward, making no mention of infidelity. It was a quiet, dignified request for the dissolution of a marriage. It was a trap, and Arthur walked right into it. His legal team, led by Harrington, responded with arrogance, offering a low-ball settlement and attempting to portray Eleanor as a grasping woman who had contributed nothing but her social grace to the marriage. They underestimated her completely. They saw the silent, elegant wife and missed the brilliant, calculating architect. Now, sitting in that courtroom, listening to the judge grant her audacious request, Eleanor felt no triumph, only a profound, hollow sadness for the man she had once loved, a man who had been living a lie his entire life and didn't even know it. The building was about to come down. She had laid the dynamite, lit the fuse, and all she could do now was stand back and watch it fall. The days following the courtroom bombshell were a blur of screaming headlines and frantic phone calls. Vance, divorce explodes, Mistress baby. And a bizarre DNA demand screamed the cover of the city's most voracious tabloid. The Vance family, a dynasty that had always controlled its own narrative with an iron fist, was suddenly the subject of rampant, humiliating speculation. Arthur was apoplectic. He called Eleanor a dozen times a day, his initial confusion curdling into raw fury. He left voicemails that swung wildly from pleading to threatening. "What the hell are you doing, Eleanor?" One message seethed. "Are you trying to destroy my family? My father is a respected man. You have no right to drag him into our mess. Call this off. Call off this insane test, and I'll give you whatever you want." Eleanor never answered. She forwarded the voicemails to Beatrice, each one another piece of evidence of his volatile and controlling nature. Her true target, however, was not Arthur, but his father. Robert Vance reacted exactly as she had predicted. He didn't plead. He commanded. He summoned Eleanor to the Vance corporate headquarters, a gleaming skyscraper in Midtown that was a monument to his ego. Eleanor walked into the lion's den without flinching. Robert's office was on the top floor, a vast expanse of dark wood, leather, and glass with a panoramic view of the city he considered his kingdom. He was standing by the window, his back to her, a titan surveying his domain. "This is a mistake," he said without turning around. His voice was a low rumble used to immediate obedience. "You are making a very grave mistake, Eleanor." "It's a divorce, Robert," she replied, her voice even. "The mistake was made long before we ever set foot in a courtroom." He turned then, his hazel eyes burning with cold fury. "Do not play games with me. This stunt with the DNA test. It is a pathetic, transparent attempt to embarrass me into a larger settlement. I will not be blackmailed." "I'm not blackmailing you," Eleanor said calmly, taking a seat opposite his enormous desk, a power move he clearly hadn't expected. "I'm protecting myself. Your family's entire financial structure is based on patrilineal succession. If this child is indeed Arthur's, she is a Vance. Her claim needs to be validated beyond reproach. I would think you of all people would appreciate the need for absolute certainty when it comes to bloodlines." She had used his own language, his own obsession, against him. He stared at her momentarily speechless. He had always seen her as a decorative, compliant daughter-in-law. This calm, steely woman was a stranger to him. "You are overreaching," he finally managed to say, his voice tight with barely suppressed rage. "You will be publicly shamed for this. I will personally see to it that your reputation is ruined. You will be a pariah." "My reputation?" Eleanor gave a small, sad smile. "Robert, your son brought his pregnant mistress into a public courtroom to humiliate me. What reputation do I have left to protect? I have nothing to lose. You, on the other hand, have built your entire life on a specific narrative. The narrative of the powerful, unbroken Vance lineage. Are you truly confident enough in that narrative to let it be scrutinized?" It was a direct challenge, a masterful piece of psychological warfare. She wasn't accusing him of anything outright. She was simply introducing a sliver of doubt, forcing him to question a truth he had never considered questionable. A flicker of something, was it fear, uncertainty, crossed his face, before being replaced by his usual mask of arrogant indignation. "Get out of my office," he snarled. Eleanor rose gracefully. "The court order stands, Robert. Your sample will be collected next Tuesday." Meanwhile, Madeline Shaw was basking in her newfound notoriety. She gave a tearful exclusive interview to a sympathetic television journalist, painting herself as the victim of a powerful family and a cold, barren wife. "All I want is for my son to have his father's name," she wept on camera, clutching a sonogram picture. "Arthur loves me. He was just trapped. He told me Eleanor was cold, that their marriage was just for show. He said he could never truly be himself with her." She was, as Eleanor had predicted, the perfect pawn. Her public pronouncements only served to harden public opinion against the Vances and make Eleanor's demand for a comprehensive DNA test seem less malicious and more like the action of a woman pushed to her absolute limit. The day of the sample collection was a tense, clinical affair. It took place not at a hospital, but at a neutral court-appointed genetics lab, ensuring the chain of custody was unbreakable. Arthur arrived looking haggard, his face pale and drawn. Robert Vance arrived flanked by 2 lawyers, his expression thunderous. He refused to look at or speak to Arthur. The rift between father and son was already a gaping chasm. They were processed separately. A simple buccal swab from the inside of each man's cheek, sealed, labeled, and signed. Madeline had her amniocentesis performed the same day the sample from her unborn child rushed to the same lab under a bailiff's supervision. In Beatrice Croft's office, the atmosphere was one of quiet anticipation. "It's a monumental gamble, Eleanor," Beatrice said, pacing in front of her window overlooking the city. "If this comes back showing what they all expect it to show, that the baby is Arthur's and Arthur is Robert's, then we've handed them a victory. We'll look vindictive and foolish. Harrington will use it to paint you as unhinged." "He will try to do that anyway," Eleanor replied, her gaze distant. She was looking at the blueprints for a small community library she had been designing pro bono, her fingers tracing the clean, logical lines. "This was never about looking good, Beatrice. It was about exposing the truth. A flawed foundation can't support a structure indefinitely. Sooner or later, it's destined to collapse. We're just testing the integrity of the concrete." Beatrice stopped pacing and looked at her client with a deep sense of admiration. In a world of loud, messy emotions, Eleanor Vance was a creature of quiet, formidable logic. She had made a calculated demand, one that everyone else saw as an act of emotional warfare. But they were all looking at the wrong part of the equation. They were focused on the mistress and the baby. They were focused on the affair. They had completely missed the real target. And in a matter of weeks, an unassuming sealed envelope would arrive, and the entire magnificent edifice of the Vance family would come crashing down. The wait for the DNA results plunged the Vance family into a state of suspended animation. The world watched, but within the gilded cages of their Park Avenue apartments and Connecticut estates, a silent psychological war was being waged. The family, which had once presented a united, impenetrable front to the world, was fracturing under the pressure of a secret nobody could yet name. Arthur became a recluse. He stopped going into the office, canceled his social engagements, and spent his days drinking expensive scotch and staring out the window of his new, sterile bachelor apartment. His fury at Eleanor had evaporated, replaced by a gnawing, shapeless dread. Her strategy made no sense to him. Why drag his father into this? Why insist on a test that could only confirm his own humiliation? He replayed their entire life together in his mind, searching for a clue. a hint of this cold, calculating woman she had become. He found nothing which terrified him even more. He felt like a man in a dark room hearing the floorboards creak all around him, knowing something was coming for him, but unable to see its face. His relationship with Madeline also began to fray. Her constant calls and texts, once a source of illicit excitement, now felt like a relentless siege. She wanted reassurances he couldn't give. She talked incessantly about their future, about the baby, about the life they would have once the Vance money was hers, theirs. Her victory in court had made her bold, and her boldness began to look like avarice. The desperate romantic woman he thought he loved was being replaced by a grasping, demanding stranger. He began to wonder if his lawyer Harrington had been right about her all along. Robert and Genevieve Vance Arthur's parents retreated behind the fortified walls of their Connecticut mansion. Genevieve, a woman whose life had been dedicated to maintaining appearances, was utterly undone by the public scandal. She wept, she raged, she blamed Eleanor, she blamed Madeline, she blamed Arthur, she blamed everyone but the patriarchal system she had so ardently upheld. Robert, however, was a different story. His initial volcanic anger had cooled into a chilling, unnerving silence. He became obsessed. He spent hours locked in his study, a room filled with leather-bound books and portraits of stern-faced Vance ancestors. He pored over old family records, birth certificates, and medical histories, as if searching for a clerical error that could explain the impending doom he felt, but could not articulate. Eleanor's demand had done more than just embarrass him. It had planted a seed of doubt in the one area of his life he had always considered sacrosanct, his own bloodline. He found himself staring at his son's photographs, really looking at him for the first time, and seeing what Eleanor had seen. The lack of resemblance, the subtle yet undeniable differences that he had dismissed for over 40 years. He started having flashbacks, fragmented memories of the early years of his marriage to Genevieve. She had been a beautiful, vivacious woman, but there had been a wild, melancholic streak to her. There had been a difficult period, a few months, when he was traveling extensively for work, when their marriage had been strained. He remembered arguments, her tears, a profound distance between them. It was a lifetime ago, a chapter he had long since sealed shut. Now Eleanor's inexplicable legal maneuver had pried it open. The whispers in their gilded cage grew louder. "Why would she do this, Robert?" Genevieve would ask him nightly, her voice shrill with hysteria. "To humiliate us. Is she a monster?" "Be quiet, Genevieve," he would command, but his voice lacked its usual booming authority. It was thin, brittle. He made a call to a very old friend, a retired doctor who had been their family physician for decades. He kept the conversation vague, asking hypothetical questions about genetic traits and recessive genes, but the old doctor, a shrewd man, could read between the lines. "Is everything all right, Robert?" Dr. Peterson asked, a note of concern in his voice. "Everything is fine," Robert lied, ending the call abruptly. But it wasn't fine. For the first time in his life, Robert Vance, a man who controlled a skyline, felt a complete and utter loss of control. He was a passenger in a car being driven by his despised daughter-in-law, and he had no idea where she was taking him. Eleanor, the driver of this chaos, remained an island of calm. She moved out of the penthouse and into a modest but elegant brownstone she had purchased years ago as an investment property. She filled it not with cold, impressive art, but with books, comfortable furniture, and the things she truly loved. She focused on her work, pouring her energy into her library blueprints. For her, the waiting period was not one of anxiety, but of grim certainty. She was like a demolition expert who had set the charges and was now simply waiting for the scheduled time on the detonator. Beatrice called her a few days before the results were due. "The lab has confirmed they will be delivered by courier to the judge on Friday morning," Beatrice said. "Copies will be sent to my office and to Harrington's simultaneously. Are you prepared, Eleanor?" "I am," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "And what if you're wrong?" Beatrice asked gently. It was the question that hung between them unspoken for weeks. Eleanor was silent for a moment. She looked at the plans on her desk, at the clean lines, and the promise of a new, quiet space built on a solid foundation. "An architect has to trust her calculations, Beatrice," she finally said. "I've checked the math 100 times. The structure is unsound." The city held its breath. The press staked out the courthouse and the lawyers' offices. Madeline Shaw confidently told a reporter she was planning a baby shower fit for a prince. Arthur Vance drank himself into a stupor, and in a grand house in Connecticut, Robert Vance stared at a portrait of his own father, a man with a hawkish nose and a powerful chin, and for the first time in his 72 years, he prayed. He prayed that the woman he had dismissed as a fool was wrong. Friday arrived under a bruised gray sky that threatened rain. The city seemed to be holding its breath. In Beatrice Croft's office on the 40th floor, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Beatrice stood by the window, watching the traffic crawl below a river of steel and hurried lives all oblivious to the dynasty-destroying information that was at that very moment making its way across town. Eleanor was not there. She had declined Beatrice's invitation to wait at the office, choosing instead the quiet solitude of her new home. They had agreed that Beatrice would call her the moment the results were in her hands. Eleanor knew that reading the cold clinical facts in a lawyer's office would feel like a business transaction. But this wasn't business. It was the final painful exhumation of a life built on lies. She needed to be in her own space on her own terms when the truth was finally laid bare. At 10:15 a.m., a junior associate buzzed Beatrice's intercom. "The courier is here, Ms. Croft, from the lab." "Send him in," Beatrice said, her voice betraying none of her inner turmoil. A uniformed courier entered, carrying a large, stiff document envelope marked with the lab's official logo and sealed with thick red wax tape. It felt absurdly theatrical, like something from a spy movie, but the legal protocols for a case this sensitive demanded it. Beatrice signed the electronic touchpad, her signature, a sharp, decisive slash. The associate showed the courier out, closing the door softly behind him. Beatrice was alone with the envelope. She placed it on the center of her expansive mahogany desk. For a full minute, she just looked at it. Inside that simple paper folder lay the power to ruin lives, to rewrite history. She thought of Eleanor, of her quiet strength, and her monumental gamble. She sent up a silent prayer that her client's intuition had been correct. To be wrong now would be a catastrophe. Taking a deep breath, she picked up a silver letter opener. With a steady hand, she slit the envelope open, the sound of tearing paper unnaturally loud in the silent room. Inside were two separate sealed reports. The first was labeled Paternity Analysis, Shaw Fetus, Arthur Vance. The second was labeled Lineage Analysis, Arthur Vance, Robert Vance. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the first report. She skipped past the pages of legal jargon and scientific methodology, her eyes scanning for the conclusion at the bottom of the page. There it was in stark, bold type conclusion. The probability of paternity is 99.9998%. Based on the analysis of the genetic markers, Arthur Vance cannot be excluded as the biological father of the male fetus carried by Madeline Shaw. Beatrice felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Part 1 was a victory for Madeline. Arthur was the father. As expected. Harrington would be gloating. The press would have a field day. This made the second report even more critical. If it showed what everyone expected, their case would be in ruins. With a sense of impending doom, she opened the second envelope. This report was structured similarly, a comparison of genetic markers between father and son. Her eyes flew to the bottom of the page to the final definitive conclusion. She read it once. Then she read it again, her mind struggling to process the words. Conclusion. The probability of paternity is 0%. Based on the analysis of the genetic markers, Robert Vance is excluded as the biological father of Arthur Vance. Beatrice sank into her leather chair, the air leaving her lungs in a rush. A slow smile spread across her face. It was not a smile of triumph, but of awe at the sheer, beautiful, devastating audacity of Eleanor's plan. She had done it. The architect had found the fatal flaw in the foundation, and the proof was right here in her hands, printed in cold, scientific, undeniable black and white. She reached for the phone and dialed Eleanor's number. It rang only once. "Beatrice," Eleanor answered. Her voice was perfectly calm, as if she were asking about the weather. "Eleanor," Beatrice began, her own voice thick with emotion. "The package has arrived." And Beatrice took a deep, steadying breath. "The first report confirms it. The baby is Arthur's." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Beatrice could hear the faint sound of Eleanor's breathing, even and controlled. "I see," was all she said. "The second report, Eleanor." Beatrice paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. "The second report confirms it, too." She didn't need to say more. Eleanor understood. "Arthur is not Robert Vance's son." Beatrice stated the words, sounding both cataclysmic and profoundly simple. Another silence, longer this time. Beatrice could picture Eleanor in her quiet brownstone, her back straight, her expression unreadable. She wasn't celebrating. She was absorbing the final confirmation of a truth she had suspected for years, a truth that had colored every interaction, every holiday, every hollow "I love you" in her marriage. "Thank you, Beatrice," Eleanor said finally. Her voice still quiet, but with an undercurrent of something new. It wasn't relief. It was finality, the end of a chapter, the clearing of a site before new construction could begin. "Inform Mr. Harrington. Tell him we will see them in court on Monday to present the findings to the judge." "What do you think they'll do?" Beatrice asked. "They will panic," Eleanor said. "Robert will try to bury it. Harrington will file motions to have the results thrown out. Arthur will simply break. But it's too late. The truth is out of the box now, and it can't be put back in." As Beatrice hung up the phone, she looked down at the two reports on her desk. One was a simple, sordid story of infidelity. The other was a tragedy 40 years in the making. Combined, they were a weapon of unimaginable power. Monday's court session would not be a hearing. It would be an execution. The courtroom on Monday morning was even more packed than it had been during Madeline's initial outburst. The air crackled with an almost unbearable level of anticipation. Every major news outlet was there, cameras poised, journalists scribbling furiously in their notepads. Madeline Shaw sat in the front row of the gallery, a smug, triumphant look on her face. She had already leaked to a friendly gossip columnist that the results were in, and that her vindication was imminent. Arthur Vance looked like a ghost. He was gaunt, his eyes hollow and bloodshot. He sat beside Mr. Harrington, who shuffled his papers with a nervous energy that betrayed his usual slick confidence. They had received the reports on Friday afternoon, and the fallout had been catastrophic. Harrington had spent the entire weekend fielding hysterical, threatening calls from Robert Vance and trying to formulate a legal strategy to suppress the second report, but he knew it was hopeless. The chain of custody was perfect, the lab unimpeachable, the court order absolute. At the plaintiff's table, Eleanor and Beatrice Croft were pillars of calm in the swirling storm. Eleanor wore a simple dark gray dress. She looked not like a victor, but like someone attending a funeral. In a way, she was. Judge Albright entered, and the room fell silent. "We are here," she began, her voice grim, "to review the results of the court-ordered DNA analysis in the matter of Vance versus Vance. Ms. Croft, since your client stipulated the terms of the test, you may present the findings." Beatrice rose, holding the certified copies of the lab reports. "Thank you, Your Honor." She walked to the center of the courtroom, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. "Your Honor, as per the court's order, a two-part analysis was conducted. The first was to determine the paternity of the child being carried by Ms. Madeline Shaw in relation to my client's husband, Mr. Arthur Vance." She paused, letting the anticipation build. Madeline leaned forward in her seat, a wide grin spreading across her face. "The results of that test are conclusive," Beatrice announced, her voice ringing through the silent room. "The certified lab report confirms with a 98% probability that Arthur Vance is the biological father of Ms. Shaw's unborn son." A loud wave of murmuring erupted. Madeline burst into performative sobs of vindicated relief. Arthur slumped in his chair as if he'd been physically struck. This was it. The public confirmation of his betrayal. The ultimate humiliation for his wife. He risked a glance at Eleanor, expecting to see her shattered, but Eleanor's expression remained unchanged. She simply watched Beatrice, waiting. "Order," Judge Albright commanded. "Let Ms. Croft finish." Beatrice waited for the room to quiet down again. "However, Your Honor," she continued, and the shift in her tone commanded everyone's attention. "That was only the first part of the analysis this court ordered. We also sought for the purposes of irrefutably establishing the child's claim to the Vance family legacy to confirm the paternal lineage between Arthur Vance and his father Robert Vance." And from the back of the courtroom, a commotion could be heard. Robert Vance, flanked by his own legal team, had just entered. He had clearly come to witness what he thought would be the suppression of the result to intimidate the court with his very presence. He stood there, his face a mask of stone-cold fury. Beatrice looked directly at him as she delivered the final fatal blow. "Your Honor, the second report is also conclusive." She raised the document high for all to see. "It states with 100% certainty that Robert Vance is excluded as the biological father of Arthur Vance." For a moment, there was absolute stunned silence. The words didn't seem to register. The concept was too monumental, too earth-shattering. Then chaos. The entire courtroom exploded. Reporters were shouting questions, camera flashes strobed like lightning, and a collective disbelieving gasp seemed to suck the very air from the room. Madeline Shaw's triumphant smile had frozen on her face, contorting into a mask of utter confusion. Her victory had just turned to ash in her mouth. She was having the baby of a Vance, yes, but not the kind of Vance she thought. Not the heir to the great Robert Vance's empire. She was having the baby of a fraud. Arthur stared blankly ahead, his mind completely shattered. The words echoed in his head, excluded as the biological father. His entire life, his identity, the name he carried, the legacy he was meant to inherit, it was all a lie. He wasn't a Vance. He was nothing. A low, guttural moan escaped his lips, a sound of pure animal agony. But the most dramatic reaction came from the back of the room. Robert Vance turned a ghastly shade of gray. His carefully constructed world, his obsession with blood and legacy, had been demolished by a single sentence. He staggered back, one hand clutching his chest, his eyes wide with a terror that went beyond public humiliation. It was the terror of a king whose entire kingdom had just been revealed to be built on sand. He looked at his wife Genevieve, who was now being helped into the courtroom by a relative, her face a mess of tears and dawning horror. Her secret was out. "This is a lie, a fabrication." Harrington was on his feet, shouting, his voice shrill with panic. "This is a malicious, fraudulent document procured by a vengeful woman. Are you accusing a court-appointed certified laboratory of perjury and fraud, Mr. Harrington?" Judge Albright asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Harrington sputtered, his argument collapsing before it even began. "No, Your Honor, but—" "Then I suggest you sit down." The judge's gaze swept over the scene of utter devastation. She looked at Arthur now, openly sobbing at his table. She looked at the apoplectic Robert Vance and the crumbling Genevieve. Finally, she looked at Eleanor, who had not moved, who had not shown a flicker of triumph. She simply sat there, a silent architect, who had just witnessed the controlled demolition she had so meticulously planned. The unraveling was complete. The truth once revealed was like a chemical reaction that could not be reversed. The great Vance family, the titans of industry, the paragons of legacy had been exposed. The foundation was not just flawed, it was non-existent. And everything they had built upon it was now turning to dust. In the aftermath of the courtroom apocalypse, the Vance empire did not just tremble, it imploded. The scandal was a feeding frenzy for the media, but the real damage was happening behind the closed doors of boardrooms and banks. The carefully constructed trusts, all based on the direct mail issue of Robert Vance, were thrown into legal chaos. Shareholders grew nervous, business partners pulled back, and the stock of Vance Holdings plummeted. The narrative of stability and unbroken legacy, which Robert had spent a lifetime cultivating, was annihilated overnight. The personal fallout was even more brutal. Robert Vance suffered a minor heart attack that evening and was hospitalized. He refused to see Arthur. He refused to see Genevieve. He lay in his private room, a fallen king, surrounded by the ruins of his kingdom, a kingdom that had never truly been his to pass on. The identity of Arthur's biological father was a secret Genevieve would take to her grave, but it hardly mattered anymore. The damage was done. Arthur had a complete breakdown. The man who had everything, a name, a fortune, a beautiful wife, a mistress carrying his child, was left with nothing. His name was a lie. The fortune was no longer his to inherit. His wife was divorcing him, and his mistress now looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. He checked into a private wellness facility, a broken man haunted by the ghost of a life he thought he had. Madeline Shaw was left in an impossible position. She would give birth to a boy who carried the Vance name, but it was a name now synonymous with scandal and fraud. The vast fortune she had dreamed of was tied up in legal battles that would likely outlast her son's childhood. Arthur, the father of her child, was a shattered shell of a man with no inheritance and no future. She had won her battle, but in the most ironic way imaginable, she had lost the war. And Eleanor walked away. The divorce settlement was swift and quiet. With the Vance family in disarray and their legal team fighting a dozen other fires, Harrington advised Arthur to agree to her terms immediately. She didn't ask for half of a fraudulent empire. She didn't ask for punitive damages. She presented a meticulously documented claim for her professional contributions to the Vance Corporation over the years, the architectural designs, the real estate consultations, the business she had helped bring in. It was a clean, professional, and undeniable claim. She received a settlement that was substantial, but it was money she had earned free from the taint of the Vance legacy. It was her severance package from a life of lies. Months later, the city had moved on to new scandals, and the Vance name had faded from the headlines. Eleanor stood on a muddy construction site in a quiet, up-and-coming neighborhood. The air smelled of damp earth and sawdust. In front of her was the cleared ground where her community library would be built. She held a set of rolled-up blueprints in her hand. She had designed it herself. It was a beautiful structure, full of light and open spaces with strong, honest lines, and a foundation of solid, reinforced concrete. It was a place for stories, a place for truth. Her phone buzzed. It was Beatrice. "He signed the final papers this morning," her lawyer said. "It's officially over, Eleanor. You're free." Eleanor looked up at the sky, a brilliant, clear blue after a week of rain. She felt a profound sense of peace settle over her, quiet and deep. She had not acted out of revenge. Revenge was a messy, emotional act. She had acted as an architect. She had identified a fatal structural flaw and knew the building had to come down before it collapsed and hurt more people. She had done it cleanly, precisely, and with a heavy heart. She had lost a husband and a life she once thought she wanted. But she had reclaimed something far more valuable herself. She was no longer Mrs. Vance, the silent, perfect wife in a gilded cage. She was Eleanor, the architect. A woman who builds things. And looking at the empty plot of land and the blueprints in her hand, she knew with absolute certainty that her greatest creation was yet to come. That's the story of Eleanor Vance, a woman who proved that the quietest person in the room is often the most powerful. She didn't scream or cry or throw plates. She waited, she planned, and she used the one thing her enemies never expected: the truth. Her story is a powerful reminder that a life built on lies, no matter how grand or imposing, has a foundation of sand ready to be washed away by the first tide of discovery. It shows us that true strength isn't about weathering the storm, but about being the one with the wisdom to predict the weather and the courage to tear down a faulty structure before it collapses on top of you. What did you think of Eleanor's incredible strategy? Was it cold-hearted justice or a masterclass in survival? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you were captivated by this story of deception, truth, and ultimate vindication, please hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a good story, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel. We bring you real-life dramas and incredible tales every week that you won't want to miss. Thank you for listening.